The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, turning the dry earth into a sea of gold. The wind carried the smell of dust and horses, and the sound of laughter came from the small town near the edge of the valley. It was the kind of laughter that hid something unkind beneath it. Inside the wooden saloon, a group of ranch hands and traders had gathered, drinking and joking as if the world outside didn't exist. Among them was Thomas Avery, a quiet man who had once fought in the war and then returned home with a broken spirit. He lived alone on his ranch miles from town, surrounded by silence and work. His hands were rough, his voice low, and his eyes distant, the kind of man who spoke only when there was a real need to. Most people in town found him strange. They respected his honesty but mocked his loneliness. That evening they played what they called a harmless joke, though it was anything but harmless. A group of men, half-drunk and full of cruel humor, decided to surprise Thomas. When a small group of travelers passed through with captives from a raid, one of them was a young Apache woman. Her name was Nayeli. She had been taken from her tribe months earlier and sold from place to place. The men laughed and said they'd give her to Thomas since he had no wife and needed company. They expected him to blush, to refuse to become the target of their amusement once again. But Thomas didn't laugh. His jaw tightened as he looked at the woman standing before him, proud, silent, and filled with quiet anger. Her dark hair was tangled from travel, her clothes worn, but her eyes burned with something fierce. She didn't cry, didn't beg. She only stood straight, looking at everyone as if measuring their worth. "Take her," one of the men said, shoving her lightly forward with a smirk. "You need someone to talk to, Tom." The room roared with laughter. Thomas didn't respond. He reached into his pocket, threw a few coins on the table, and said in a calm voice, "Enough." The laughter faded. No one knew if he was angry or just tired of their cruelty. He turned to the woman and said softly, "You don't belong here." She didn't answer, only followed him out the door, perhaps because she had nowhere else to go. Outside, the evening air was cool, and the desert stretched wide and silent. Thomas untied his horse and offered her the reins. She hesitated but accepted. They rode in silence toward his ranch, the sky above painted with streaks of red and purple. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say between two strangers forced into a situation neither wanted. When they reached his small wooden cabin, Thomas helped her down and showed her the barn where she could rest. It wasn't much, just a few tools, a cot, and some blankets, but it was cleaner and safer than the places she had seen recently. He didn't try to talk or touch her. He only said, "You can stay here for now. Tomorrow we'll decide what to do." She nodded once, her expression unreadable. That night, Thomas sat by the fireplace inside his cabin, staring at the flickering flames. Outside, the wind blew gently, carrying the distant howl of coyotes. He thought about what had happened, the laughter, the shame, the way people treated others like jokes or possessions. He had fought in a war to protect human dignity, yet now he saw men mocking it for sport. He didn't understand the world anymore. In the barn, Nayeli sat on the cot, her hands wrapped around her knees. She looked at the stars through the open window, remembering her tribe, her people, and the songs they used to sing at night. Everything she loved had been taken from her, her land, her family, her freedom. She didn't know who this man was or what he wanted, but she sensed something different in him. He hadn't laughed at her, hadn't treated her like an object. Still, she was wary. Trust was not something she could give easily. The next morning, the sky was pale and bright. Thomas stepped outside, his hat pulled low, and began his chores. The ranch was small, a few horses, some cattle, and acres of dry land that needed constant work. He noticed Nayeli watching from the doorway, her eyes cautious but alert. "You can eat inside," he said simply. She hesitated, then followed. He served her some bread and beans. She ate quietly, avoiding his gaze while he worked near the window, pretending not to watch her. For days they lived like this, two souls sharing the same space but walking around each other like shadows. She slept near the fireplace at night, wrapped in an old blanket, while he kept to his room. He never locked the door. Part of him wanted her to know she could leave any time she wanted. One morning he woke up to find the barn door open and one of the horses missing. He thought she had run away. Saddened but not surprised, he went to track the horse. To his surprise, he found Nayeli a mile away, leading the frightened animal back carefully. She had gone to bring it home before sunrise. When she saw him, she said the first words he had heard from her. Horse was scared. Her voice was soft but steady. Thomas nodded and replied, "Thank you." That small moment changed something between them. After that day, she began helping more around the ranch, feeding the animals, gathering water, even repairing fences. She worked with quiet skill, and Thomas respected her space. Sometimes he would glance up from his work and find her watching the sky, as if remembering a world that no longer existed. He wondered what her story was but didn't ask. Instead, he tried to show kindness through small gestures, leaving food for her, making sure she had clean clothes, giving her tools to work with. Slowly, the silence between them began to feel less heavy. One afternoon, while they were both working near the corral, Thomas accidentally cut his hand on a piece of wire. It wasn't deep, but it bled badly. Nayeli saw him wince and hurried over without hesitation. She took his hand gently and wrapped it in a strip of cloth from her own dress. He tried to pull away, saying, "It's fine," but she shook her head. "You can't work if it gets worse," she said firmly. Her care surprised him. He looked at her and saw something more than just a stranger or a victim. He saw courage, grace, and a quiet strength that came from surviving things he could never imagine. That night, as he sat by the fire, he found himself thinking about her differently, not with pity but with admiration. In the days that followed, their rhythm became natural. She taught him a few Apache words, and he taught her some English. They spoke little, but they understood each other more with every passing day. When the wind blew dust across the plains, they stood side by side, facing it together. Still, Thomas couldn't forget how she came to him, as part of a cruel joke. It made him restless. He wanted to make things right somehow. One day, he saddled his horse and rode into town. The same men who had laughed before were sitting outside the saloon. When they saw him, they smirked. "How's your little gift doing, Avery?" one of them said mockingly. Thomas didn't answer. He looked each of them in the eye and said, "She's not yours to speak about." His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. The laughter died. Without another word, he turned and rode back home. When he returned, Nayeli was tending to the horses. She looked up, sensing his mood. He didn't explain what had happened, only said, "You don't owe anyone anything here." She gave a small nod, a sign that she understood. That evening, as the desert sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of fire and rose, the two of them sat outside the cabin in silence. The world around them was wide and quiet, and though neither said a word, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile trust beginning to form in the middle of a lonely land. For the first time since she had arrived, Nayeli allowed herself to rest. For the first time in years, Thomas felt less alone. The wind carried the sound of distant crickets, and the night settled gently over them, as if the desert itself was watching their story begin. The mornings at the ranch began quietly. The sound of wind brushing against dry grass was the only thing that moved before sunrise. Thomas woke early, as always, and stepped out into the cold air. He could smell the faint smoke of last night's fire, see the pale blue light spreading across the horizon, and hear the soft rustle of movement near the barn. Nayeli was already awake, feeding the horses before he even reached the corral. He stopped for a moment to watch her. The horses were calm around her, more than they ever were with him. She spoke to them in a low tone, not in English but in her own language, and somehow they understood. She moved gracefully as if she belonged to the land and every living thing upon it. Thomas didn't say anything. He didn't want to break the stillness between them. When she noticed him standing there, she gave a short nod, acknowledging him without a word. That small gesture had become their morning greeting. He nodded back and went to fetch water from the well. They worked separately most of the day, but their paths crossed again and again, in quiet tasks, in shared glances, in unspoken understanding. Days passed, and the uneasy silence that once filled the ranch began to change. It no longer felt heavy or uncomfortable. It became a kind of peace. Nayeli started to hum softly while she worked. Her songs were unfamiliar, but there was something soothing in the sound. Sometimes when the wind carried her voice across the dry land, Thomas stopped what he was doing just to listen. He found himself noticing the little things, how she tied her hair back before working, how she moved with confidence when handling the animals, how she never complained no matter how hard the day was. She wasn't afraid of the dirt, the heat, or the loneliness. She had faced far worse, he knew. One afternoon, while fixing a fence post, Thomas cut his arm again. The wire slipped and a deep scratch formed along his wrist. He muttered softly and kept working, but Niley saw the blood and came over quickly. She took his hand, looked at the wound, and shook her head. Without asking, she led him back to the cabin. He didn't resist. She cleaned the cut with warm water and crushed herbs she had gathered earlier. He didn't even know what they were, but when she pressed the mixture gently onto the wound, it stung less. "You know medicine?" he asked quietly. She looked up and nodded. "My mother teach me," she said in broken English. Then she wrapped the cloth around his wrist carefully and added, "Now you rest." Thomas smiled faintly, a rare thing. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and for the first time Nayeli almost smiled back. It was quick and small, but it lit her face like sunlight breaking through clouds. After that, Thomas began to talk a little more. Nothing deep, just small, simple things about the ranch, the weather, or the animals. Nayeli listened, answering with a few English words or sometimes only a nod. She had a quiet intelligence that didn't need many words. Even when she didn't speak, Thomas felt she understood him better than most people ever had. As the days turned into weeks, a rhythm formed between them. Nayeli took care of the animals and gathered food from the wild. Berries, roots, and herbs Thomas didn't even know were edible. She taught him how to find water by looking for certain plants and how to track animals by their footprints. In return, he showed her how to use farm tools and how to handle a horse with reins. Slowly, she began to ride one of the gentler horses, and her face softened each time the animal obeyed her touch. One evening, when the sky was painted in orange and gold, Thomas sat outside sharpening tools. Nayeli was sitting a few feet away repairing an old blanket. After a long silence, she asked softly, "Why you live alone?" Thomas paused. The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, then at the horizon. "After the war, I didn't want to be around people," he said slowly. "Too many memories, too many loud voices. Out here it's quiet. The land doesn't lie to you." She listened carefully. Then she said, "Quiet is good, but too quiet. Heart forgets to speak." Her words stayed with him long after she went inside. He thought about them as the stars appeared one by one above the dark desert. For years he had believed that silence was peace, but now he wondered if maybe silence was just another kind of loneliness. The next morning, Thomas decided to do something different. He saddled his horse and asked Nayeli, "You want to see the canyon?" She hesitated, unsure if he was serious, then nodded. They rode side by side across the open land. The air was crisp and the sound of hooves echoed softly across the ground. When they reached the edge of the canyon, the world opened up before them, a deep valley carved by time, glowing in shades of red and gold under the sun. Nayeli's eyes widened. For a long time, neither spoke. She looked out over the vast space and whispered something in her language, her voice filled with awe. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. They sat there for a while, just watching the land stretch endlessly before them. Then Thomas said quietly, "Beautiful, isn't it?" Nayeli nodded. "The earth remembers," she said softly. "Even when people forget." When they rode back, something between them had changed. They didn't feel like strangers anymore. There was still distance, but it was no longer a wall, more like a bridge being built slowly, piece by piece. As the weeks went on, Thomas began to rely on Nayeli's presence more than he realized. He looked forward to her quiet humming, her calm way of handling chaos, her steady gaze that could silence his restless thoughts. Sometimes, when the evenings grew cold, she would sit near the fire, telling short stories in broken English. Stories about the stars, the animals, and her mother's lessons. He listened carefully, as if each word was something precious being shared. In return, he told her small things about his life. How he used to have a brother who didn't come back from the war. How he once dreamed of owning a big ranch full of horses. How life never turned out quite as planned. She listened with gentle eyes, never interrupting, never judging, but the outside world wasn't as kind. The men from town began to talk again. Some laughed when they saw Thomas bringing supplies with Nayeli by his side. Others whispered when he walked by. They didn't understand the quiet bond forming between the two. To them, it was something to gossip about. Thomas heard their laughter one afternoon when he rode into town alone. It stung, but he said nothing. He had learned that words couldn't change small minds. Still, when he returned home, Nayeli noticed his silence. She didn't ask, but she knew. Instead, She made a small meal of corn cakes and beans, leaving it on the table for him. That small act spoke louder than any comfort could. Later that night, as Thomas sat by the fire, he looked at her across the room. She was mending a torn saddle strap, her hair falling across her face. He realized something quietly. His home no longer felt empty. The laughter of cruel men in town didn't matter anymore. What mattered was here, the firelight, the soft sound of her voice, the peace that came from shared work and mutual respect. One evening, a storm came over the hills. The wind howled and rain began to fall, rare and heavy. The animals grew restless. Thomas rushed out to secure the barn door, but the wind was strong and he stumbled. Nayeli ran out holding a lantern high, her hair whipping in the rain. Together, they managed to close the door and calm the horses. When they came back inside, both drenched and breathless, they laughed, really laughed, for the first time together. It was the kind of laughter that comes from exhaustion and relief. It broke whatever walls had been left between them. That night, after the storm passed, the sky cleared and stars filled the heavens like scattered fire. Thomas sat by the fire, his bandaged wrist resting on his knee, watching the flames dance. Nayeli sat nearby, drying her hair. For a long time, neither spoke. Then he said softly, "Thank you." She looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For staying," he said simply. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that meant more than words, and whispered, "The wind brought me here." "Maybe it knew you were lonely." Thomas didn't reply. He only looked at her and thought that maybe, for the first time in years, the wind had brought him something good. Outside, the desert was quiet again, washed clean by rain. Inside the small cabin, two lonely hearts, once strangers, had begun to find something neither of them had expected: peace in each other's presence and a reason to hope again. The days turned warm as spring settled over the desert. The land that had once looked dry and lifeless began to show color again. Tiny yellow flowers bloomed along the edges of the dusty paths, and the air carried a softer breeze. Life on the ranch moved in a steady rhythm now, calm, almost peaceful. Thomas and Nayeli worked together every day. The silence that had once felt heavy was now gentle, like a language of its own. They no longer needed many words. A glance or a small nod was enough to understand what the other meant. In the mornings, Thomas often found Nayeli near the stream that ran close to the property, gathering water or washing clothes. Sometimes she sang softly while she worked, songs in her native tongue full of mystery and sadness. Her voice blended with the sound of running water, creating a peace that Thomas had never known before. He would watch from a distance, not wanting to disturb her, feeling something stir quietly inside him, something he didn't yet dare to name. Nayeli had changed too. When she first arrived, her eyes had carried only pain and fear. Now they held something else: calmness, strength, and even a hint of trust. She still kept her guard up, but the lines of worry on her face had softened. The land had begun to feel familiar to her. The horses recognized her steps. The ranch dogs followed her wherever she went. Sometimes, in the evenings, they would share small stories. Thomas told her about his childhood in the East, about snow and green hills she had never seen. She listened with wonder, imagining a world covered in white, where rivers froze and people lit fires to stay warm. Then she told him about her tribe, about nights under the stars, dances around the fire, and the elders who told stories of the moon guiding lost travelers home. Her voice was soft, but her words painted pictures so clear that Thomas could almost see them. He found himself laughing more these days. He didn't even remember the last time he had truly laughed before she came. Nayeli noticed that too. Once, when he was trying to repair the fence and accidentally dropped the hammer on his boot, he cursed under his breath, and she couldn't help but laugh. The sound surprised them both. It was light and musical, and Thomas found himself smiling despite the pain. That small moment stayed with him for days. Still, outside their small world, whispers began to grow louder. The town nearby couldn't stop talking about the quiet rancher and the Apache woman living together. People had a way of twisting kindness into gossip. Some said she had bewitched him. Others claimed he had lost his mind. But Thomas didn't care. The ranch was far enough that their voices couldn't reach him, and he had long stopped caring about small minds and cruel hearts. Yet sometimes, when he went into town for supplies, he could feel their eyes following him. He kept his head down, finished his business, and rode home quickly. When he arrived, Nayeli would see the tightness in his jaw and ask, "Bad people again?" Her English had grown better, though still simple. Thomas would nod and say, "Doesn't matter. They don't know us." One night they sat outside watching the stars. The sky stretched endlessly above them, filled with light and silence. Thomas pointed to a cluster of stars and said, "That one's called the Hunter." Nayeli followed his hand and said softly, "My people call it the Protector. He watches over travelers." Thomas looked at her. "Then maybe he's watching over us too." She smiled faintly. "Maybe." The fire crackled softly between them. The warmth of the flames reflected in her eyes, and for a long moment, neither spoke. There was something about the night, about the shared silence and the soft light, that felt different. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was connection. Two people who had lost everything had somehow found a small world where they belonged. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. They worked as a team, their movements almost in rhythm. When Thomas struggled with something, Nayeli was already there, helping without being asked. When she was tired or quiet, Thomas gave her space but made sure she had everything she needed. It wasn't something planned or spoken about. It just happened naturally, as if the land itself had decided they needed each other. One afternoon, a strong wind swept through the valley, carrying dust and dry leaves. The air turned sharp, and the horses became restless. Thomas and Nayeli worked quickly to calm them, covering the stable doors and tying the loose boards. In the middle of it, a heavy gust knocked a ladder down, barely missing Nayeli. Thomas rushed to her side and pulled her close without thinking. For a moment she froze, her heart pounding. Then she looked up at him, not in fear but in quiet surprise. He realized he was holding her and stepped back quickly, his face flushed. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm fine." Her voice was calm, but there was something new in her eyes, something that lingered even after they went back to work. That night Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat by the window looking out into the darkness. He wasn't sure what he was feeling. It wasn't just gratitude or respect anymore. It was deeper, something both comforting and frightening. He wondered if she felt it too, or if it was just his lonely heart searching for warmth. Nayeli, lying near the fire, watched the flames dance. She too felt something changing inside her. For months she had been guarded, afraid to let anyone close again. But Thomas was different. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything from her, never treated her as less than equal. She saw in him the same loneliness she carried. That understanding bound them quietly, stronger than any words could. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the sky clear and blue. The air smelled fresh, and the land looked washed clean. They worked in silence most of the day, but it wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. When the sun began to set, Thomas stopped by the corral and watched Nayeli feeding the horses. "You've made them calmer," he said. "They listen to you more than they ever listened to me." She smiled a little. "They feel the heart," she said. "Animals know when someone is kind." He looked at her for a long moment and said softly, "Then they must trust you a lot." She met his eyes and replied, "Maybe they trust you too." Then she turned back to the horses, but Thomas noticed the faint color on her cheeks. That evening, when they sat down to eat, the mood was quiet but warm. Thomas told her a story about how he once got lost in the woods as a boy and found his way home by following the North Star. Nayeli listened intently and then said, "My people say stars are old souls, people who came before us shining to show us the way." He smiled. "Then maybe your people and mine aren't so different after all." For a moment her eyes softened. "Maybe not." After dinner, as Thomas put another log on the fire, Nayeli looked around the cabin. "This place, it feels alive now," she said slowly. "Before, when I came, it was quiet. Cold. Now it feels warm. Thomas looked around. Too. At the repaired walls, the small handmade decorations she had added, the herbs drying near the window. He realized she was right. The cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore, it had become a home. He looked at her and said quietly, "You made it that way." She looked at him, a little surprised, then smiled. "No," she said softly. "We did." Outside, the wind had gone still. The desert stretched silent under the moonlight, vast and endless. But inside that small cabin, there was a sense of peace neither of them had felt in years. They were still two people from different worlds, one a rancher haunted by his past, the other a woman torn from her people. Yet somehow fate had placed them together in the same story. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both understood the truth, that something precious had begun to grow between them. Something fragile but real, something worth holding on to in a world that had taken so much from them both. Spring had warmed into early summer, and the desert was alive with color and sound. Birds called from the sparse trees, insects buzzed near the creek, and the horses grazed quietly in the soft light of morning. Life on the ranch had settled into a rhythm, comfortable yet never dull. Thomas and Naeli moved together through the days, their teamwork almost instinctive. Tasks that once took hours were now accomplished with ease because they worked as one, each knowing what the other would do without having to speak. One afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the horizon. Thomas noticed them first while fixing a fence near the corral. "Storm coming," he muttered, squinting at the sky. Naeli, who had been tending the horses, nodded, her sharp eyes already scanning the distant hills. She moved with swift precision, checking the stalls and making sure each animal was secure. Thomas followed, gathering tools and closing the barn doors. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the faint scent of rain. Then the fire started. It was small at first, a spark from a dry branch that had been struck by lightning or perhaps carried on the wind from some distant place. The flames licked the grass, growing faster than Thomas could reach with water buckets. Panic flickered through him for the first time in years. He realized how fragile life could be, even on a land he thought he knew so well. Naeli was already moving before he could speak. She guided the horses toward a natural ravine on the property, keeping them calm with her soft voice and gentle touch. The animals, usually skittish, followed her without hesitation. Thomas helped, throwing down the reins and guiding the largest horse with all his strength. Sparks danced around them and the heat brushed against his face, but Naeli remained calm, her focus unwavering. When they returned to the ranch buildings, the fire had spread, and Thomas realized that saving everything was impossible. He turned to Naeli, fear in his voice. "We can't stop it all." She looked at him, steady and calm. "We do what we can," she said simply. Then, without waiting for him to reply, she led him to the supplies they could save. Food, blankets, tools, stacking them away from the flames, dampening anything that could catch fire. Thomas followed her instructions quickly, amazed at her confidence. She didn't panic. She had survived worse than this and somehow knew how to face it. Hours passed. They worked through smoke and heat, their clothes soaked with sweat. Thomas tried to fight the flames with water from buckets, but the dry brush around the ranch made every effort nearly useless. Naeli guided him where to pour water and how to use the wet hides to protect the supplies. She didn't complain, didn't falter. Her strength became his strength. By the time the sun sank low, most of the ranch was scorched. The barn had blackened walls, fences were charred, and the smell of smoke hung heavy in the air. But they were alive. The animals were safe in the ravine, the tools were saved, and even some of the hay had been rescued. They stood together, breathing heavily, soot covering their faces. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Thomas finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "We're alone. Let's do what's necessary." It wasn't a statement of fear or desperation. It was recognition. Recognition that despite everything, they could face what came next, together. Naeli nodded, a small smile touching her lips. She understood. Survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about trust, partnership, and knowing that someone had your back even in the worst of times. That night they sat near the fire, exhausted, their bodies aching from the day's work. Thomas brought out what little food they had saved, bread, dried meat, some vegetables, and they shared it quietly. The firelight flickered across their faces. revealing the traces of smoke and sweat, but also something deeper: relief, gratitude, and a bond that had grown stronger in the face of disaster. In the days that followed, they began to rebuild. It was slow work. Fences had to be repaired, the barn reinforced, and the burned patches of earth cleared. Thomas worked harder than he had in years, driven not by pride but by a need to restore what had been lost. Naily was beside him every step of the way, her hands skilled and precise. She taught him to plant seeds in areas the fire hadn't destroyed, showing him how to care for the soil so it would recover. During this time, their unspoken bond deepened. Thomas found himself relying on her more than ever, not just for work but for guidance, for quiet encouragement, for the comfort of her steady presence. Naily, too, trusted him more fully. She would make decisions about the animals or the land and then glance at him, seeking his approval. When he nodded, she smiled, and the connection between them felt unbreakable. One afternoon, as they worked together to rebuild the corral, Thomas paused to catch his breath. He looked at Naily, wiping sweat from his brow, and noticed the way her hair caught the sunlight, the way her eyes reflected the sky, the determination in her hands. He felt a surge of admiration and something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat of the sun. Naily noticed his gaze and met it for a brief moment. Then she turned back to her work, but he could see the quiet acknowledgement there, a recognition that what they were building was more than just fences and barns. At night, when the work was done, they would sit by the fire. They spoke little, mostly letting the crackle of the flames fill the silence. Occasionally, Thomas would tell her stories about the war, about mistakes he had made, and victories that weren't really victories at all. Naily would respond with stories of her people, of lessons her mother had taught her, of songs that carried meaning beyond words. Each story, each small gesture built a bridge between them. One evening, a traveler passed by the ranch. He had heard about the fire and came to check if anyone needed help. Thomas welcomed him, and Naily prepared a small meal for the man without complaint. The traveler commented on how calm and organized the ranch seemed despite the disaster. Thomas and Naily exchanged a small look. Their work had turned chaos into order, and in doing so they had discovered something profound, that together they could endure anything. The following morning, Thomas rode to check the surrounding land. He found burned patches where nothing could grow and other areas untouched by the fire, still rich with life. He thought about how fragile life was, how quickly it could change. When he returned, Naily was waiting with the animals, calm and steady as always. She handed him a bucket of water and said, "We do what we can, always." Her words stayed with him. They had faced fire, chaos, and loss together, and yet here they were, alive, rebuilding, stronger than before. Thomas realized that life wasn't about avoiding disasters but facing them step by step with someone you could trust. And for the first time in years he felt hope, not the empty kind that fades quickly, but a steady, enduring hope that had taken root in the soil of their shared struggle. As summer approached, the ranch slowly began to look like home again. The fences were patched, the barn reinforced, and the animals returned to their routines. Thomas and Naily moved through the days with quiet confidence. They laughed more now, small bursts of joy that punctuated the hard work. Naily sometimes teased Thomas gently when he made a mistake, and he responded with rare smiles. Their bond was no longer just about survival. It had grown into something stronger, a quiet companionship built on respect, trust, and shared experience. One night, after the sun had dipped below the hills and the sky was filled with stars, Thomas looked at Naily sitting by the fire. "We've done well," he said quietly. She nodded, her face illuminated by the firelight. "Yes, we survived together." He realized she was right. The fire had tested them, but it had also shown them what they were capable of. Alone, neither would have succeeded. Together, they had faced fear, danger, and uncertainty, and come through stronger. The bond they shared was more than friendship. It was partnership, trust, and something neither had expected to find after all they had lost. The desert stretched quiet and vast around them. The wind whispered through the burned trees, the stars shimmered, and the night carried the scent of earth and recovery. Thomas and Naily sat side by side, exhausted but at peace, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. And in that silence under the endless sky, they both understood something simple yet profound. Life would not always be easy, but together they could endure anything. Summer had settled fully over the desert. The air was warm, dry and full of light, carrying the scent of grass, earth, and the occasional bloom of desert flowers. The ranch, once devastated by fire and struggle, had begun to recover. Fences were sturdy, the barn solid again, and the animals moved with calm confidence. Life was not easy, but it was steady, and Thomas and Nayeli had learned to move through it together, understanding one another without the need for many words. The mornings were the same as they had come to know them. Thomas rose early, pulling on his worn boots and adjusting his hat against the rising sun. Nayeli was already outside, feeding the horses and gathering water. The quiet hum of her songs mingled with the gentle sound of running water, birds calling from nearby trees, and the soft creak of leather against the saddles. Thomas watched her for a moment, letting himself admire the calm efficiency with which she moved. The way she cared for the animals, the way she understood the land, it was clear she was no ordinary companion. Over the months, their bond had grown into something stronger than simple friendship. They had faced storms, fire, and isolation together, and through every trial they had discovered trust, respect, and the quiet strength of partnership. The laughter that had once seemed impossible now came easily. Thomas found himself telling her stories, and she would listen, eyes wide with interest, sometimes laughing at the moments that brought him joy or shaking her head at the ones that had gone wrong. In return, she shared stories of her tribe, tales of courage, wisdom, and guidance passed down through generations. The cabin, once a cold and lonely place, now felt warm and alive with their shared history. Yet the world beyond their little ranch still existed. The town nearby remained the same, filled with gossip and judgment. Travelers and neighbors often whispered about the rancher and the Apache woman living together, turning their bond into stories to laugh about. But Thomas no longer cared. He had learned that respect and understanding were more important than approval. Nayeli had learned the same. Together, they had created a space where judgment and cruelty had no meaning. One day, a few townspeople came riding toward the ranch, curious about how it had survived the fire and rebuilt so quickly. Thomas met them at the gate, and Nayeli appeared beside him, calm and poised. The men looked at her, expecting fear, uncertainty, or meekness. They were met with strength, confidence, and dignity. One of the men, trying to smirk, asked, "So she's still here, Avery?" Thomas looked at him steadily. "She's not here for anyone else," he said calmly. "She's not a joke. She's my equal. She helped save this ranch, and she saved my life. That's all you need to know." The men were silent. For the first time, Thomas saw that his words had weight. Nayeli, standing beside him, gave a small nod of acknowledgement. They had become partners in every sense, and the town could no longer twist their bond into mockery. Life returned to its quiet rhythm after that encounter. The ranch flourished and the animals thrived. Thomas began to notice small changes in the land. Shoots of green pushing through soil that had been scorched, the creek carrying more water than before, and the wildflowers returning along the edges of the paths. Nayeli tended to them carefully, showing him how nature could recover if treated with patience and care. In a way, the ranch had become a reflection of their own lives, something once damaged, slowly rebuilding, resilient and full of potential. Evenings were their favorite time. They would sit outside by the fire, letting the day's work fall away. Thomas would watch the sun set behind the distant hills, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, while Nayeli would hum quietly or tell stories in her soft, lyrical voice. Sometimes they would simply sit in silence, letting the wind carry their thoughts across the open land. Words were not always necessary. The shared comfort of presence was enough. One evening, as the stars appeared above the desert, Thomas broke the silence. "I never thought I could feel at home again," he said quietly. Nayeli looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Home is not just a place," she replied softly. "It is where heart feels safe, where trust lives." "We built it," Thomas nodded. Her words touched something deep inside him. For the first time, he understood that home had not been about walls or land or wealth. It had been about connection, understanding, and someone who could stand beside you in the worst moments and the best. Nayeli had become that for him, and he for her. They began planning for the future, small things at first, repairing barns, planting gardens, improving fences, but gradually moving toward larger dreams. They spoke of expanding the ranch, caring for more animals and maybe even welcoming travelers who needed guidance or shelter. The fire that had once destroyed their life together had also shown them their resilience, and they were determined to nurture it into something lasting. One morning, as Thomas checked the perimeter of the ranch, he noticed a small group of travelers struggling with a broken wagon. Naomi had already seen them and was rushing forward to help. Together they assisted the travelers, showing patience, skill, and kindness. Thomas watched her move with ease and confidence, and he realized that the woman he had once met as a silent stranger had become the most essential person in his life. She had changed the ranch, yes, but she had changed him even more. The travelers thanked them profusely, commenting on the unusual partnership they had witnessed. Thomas simply nodded, and Naomi offered a quiet smile. They didn't need to explain themselves. Their bond was clear in every movement, every gesture, and every shared glance. As summer began to wane, the ranch was thriving. Thomas and Naomi had built a life that was strong, steady, and full of quiet joy. They had faced challenges that could have broken them, yet they had endured and grown stronger together. The animals were healthy, the land productive, and their home filled with warmth and laughter. More than anything, they had discovered something priceless, a partnership built on respect, trust, and unspoken understanding. One evening, as the sun set in a sky of pink and gold, Thomas and Naomi sat outside, watching the desert stretch endlessly before them. Thomas reached out, taking her hand in his. She looked at him, surprised for just a moment, then held his hand firmly. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic words. Everything that mattered was already there, in the touch, in the quiet presence, in the knowledge that they had each other. "We've come a long way," Thomas said softly. Naomi nodded. "Yes, together." The wind stirred the dry grasses at the edge of the ranch, carrying the scent of flowers and the promise of new beginnings. They sat in silence, letting the warmth of the fire and the comfort of each other's presence fill the night. There was peace now, a deep and enduring peace that neither of them had known in years. The world outside might continue to judge, whisper, and doubt, but it didn't matter. They had created their own world, one where respect, trust, and quiet joy were more valuable than anything else. They had turned loneliness into companionship, fear into courage, and hardship into a bond that nothing could break. In the following weeks, their life continued in the rhythm they had built together. They worked the ranch, cared for the animals, and shared stories under the stars. Travelers sometimes stopped by, curious about the unusual partnership, and left with a new understanding of what respect and kindness could create. The town, once cruel and judgmental, slowly began to notice the change in Thomas and Naomi, though few understood the depth of their connection. One morning, as the first frost of late summer brushed the edges of the desert, Thomas looked out over the ranch and smiled. Naomi was nearby, tending to the horses. He realized then that life had given him something he never expected, a companion, a partner, a friend, and perhaps even a kind of love that didn't need words to exist. Naomi caught his gaze and smiled back, understanding perfectly what he felt. The sun rose higher, warming the desert once more. Together they walked the ranch side by side, prepared to face whatever the future might hold. The fire, the storms, the loneliness, and the hardships had all been tests of character and heart, and they had passed together stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever. The story of Thomas Avery and Naomi, once the subject of cruel jokes and town gossip, had transformed into something far greater. They had built a life rooted in respect, trust, and the quiet joy of shared experience. The ranch was no longer just a place of work or survival. It was a home, a sanctuary, and a symbol of resilience. They were no longer alone. They had each other, and that was enough. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the desert, Thomas and Naomi stood together, watching the light fade. The world was vast and full of uncertainty, but they had discovered a truth that was simple and powerful. Together, they could endure anything. Together, they could build a life filled with peace, respect, and hope. And in that shared understanding, they had found their home.